Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 4 October 2025. On Friday, the 4th of October, 1957, 68 years ago today, the USSR launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite of Earth. This action initiated both the space age and then the space race. At some point in the future, 500 years from now, or 1,000 years from now, or more, the Sputnik moment may be seen as an inflection point for a new kind of civilization. Or it may be seen as an insignificant historical event that caused a stir at the time, but ultimately issued in little or no substance. We're still too close to the event to properly assess its historical significance, so only time will tell. The space race put human beings on the moon, but ultimately the lack of follow-through meant that the space race in and of itself amounted to little. Once the space race was perceived as having been won, it seemed pointless to many to follow up on the moon landings with anything further. The budget for NASA, which had ballooned to a little over 4% of the U.S. GDP during the years of the rapid development of the Apollo program, peaking in 1966, 67, and 68, shrank as dramatically as it had grown. By the time the actual moon landings happened, the budget was already being cut back. Several additional moon landings were canceled, and then, despite there being a detailed plan from Boeing for Mars missions that would have built on the moon missions, and you can read all 6 volumes of the 1968 Integrated Manned Interplanetary Spacecraft Concept Definition Final Report, if you like, because it's all online, Nixon then effectively ended the space program as it had existed during the space race. A space program continued, but it was nothing like what was envisioned by the men who had made Apollo possible. But we need to acknowledge how important an historical episode the space race was, even if it ultimately fizzled out. There are a couple of papers by a woman with a Greek name that I can't pronounce properly, Eleni Panagiotarachou. Sorry for mispronouncing that. Agonal Conflict and Space Exploration and War. What is it good for? Nonviolent was an impetus for space exploration. These 2 papers have argued that the Cold War space race was a form of nonviolent competition, and that, quote, insofar as the Cold War was nonviolent, and insofar as it prompted the 2 main political and military protagonists to engage in a competitive endeavor of superiority, for example, the space race, it resembled the ancient Greek spirit of agon, whereby the objective was not to annihilate one's opponent, but to surpass them in a struggle for excellence, unquote. The space race constituted just this kind of constructive form of competition, and this is a rare event in history. Most competition between states is destructive. Mostly it takes the form of warfare. During the space race, however, 2 superpowers who possessed the technological wherewithal to effectively end civilization through a massive intercontinental exchange of ballistic missiles briefly chose to compete for prestige in a human and technological adventure. Of course, there were proxy wars going on at the same time, so the Cold War during the 1960s wasn't purely a contest of prestige. But this competition over achievements in space was part of the Cold War, and the money spent on space competition wasn't being directly spent on war. Admittedly, the space technologies developed in the space race were dual use, as any advances made in aerospace technology were directly applicable to military hardware. Just as the development of atomic weapons was tied to the Second World War, the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles that could deliver nuclear weapons from one hemisphere to another was tied to the Cold War, and though it also had its roots in the technological developments of the Second World War, specifically Wernher von Braun's V-2 rocket. Still, the money being spent on space at least wasn't being used directly to kill people or to destroy infrastructure, as is often the case in great power competition. It could be argued that this wasn't absolutely unprecedented in human history. Once Versailles was built, the other absolute monarchs of Europe felt the need to compete with similarly ostentatious displays and sumptuous gardens, and this was another non-violent competition that absorbed resources that might have been expended in violent competition. We should regard it as a hopeful insight that human beings can, at least at times, satisfy their desire for competition in nonviolent ways. And whenever we see this happening, we ought to encourage it as being better than the alternative. As hopeful then as we ought to regard the space race, the human, all too human rivalry of it was distasteful to many, even if it was far preferable to spending the money on war. Many at the time denigrated the space race, and they were right that it was an outgrowth of the Cold War, and that it was, moreover, a concession to a public perception of an us against them zero-sum conflict, which was what the Cold War was in its simplest terms. The human, all too human elements of the space race, competition, nationalism, the drive to succeed at any cost, the struggle for recognition, which so effortlessly engaged the public interest, repelled many intellectuals. Bertrand Russell, for example, perhaps the most eminent philosopher of his generation, was left cold by the space race. There's a 2003 article by Chad Trainer, Earth to Russell, that details Russell's dismissive attitude to the space race, with several quotes from Russell like this. Quote, "I am afraid that it is from baser motives that governments are willing to spend the enormous sums involved in making space travel possible." Unquote. And when I read of plans to defile the heavens by the petty squabbles of the animated lumps that disgrace a certain planet, I cannot but feel that the men who made these plans are guilty of a kind of impiety. Unquote. This wasn't the first time that Russell found himself incapable of understanding the passions that were transforming the world around him. Russell's response to the outbreak of the First World War, when Russell was entirely immune to what was called the August madness of celebration that greeted the outbreak of the war, also demonstrated his disconnection from public sentiment. Precisely because the Cold War could be understood by everyone in their respective societies, it was a powerful motivator that could drive spending on science and technology that would otherwise be incomprehensible to the masses whose work makes it all possible. The ready comprehensibility of the Cold War made it a déclassé rallying point for the common people who wouldn't ordinarily have any point of contact with geopolitics. Intellectual contempt for the space race as a manifestation of the Cold War was in part the same contempt for the lower classes that we find among intellectuals in mass societies who feel the need to make a special effort to differentiate themselves by belittling anything that resonates with ordinary people. But with the end of the space race, this particular manifestation of contempt for the little people receded into the background to be taken over by other forms. Also, with the end of the space race, we entered into a new period of the space age. My periodization of history centered on space exploration is tripartite. I call the three periods prehistory, the founding era, and the stagnant era. Prehistory is everything before Sputnik, and which could especially be considered the aviation and aeronautical developments leading up to Sputnik. The founding era, the second of the three, I count from the Sputnik crisis to the Apollo program. And the third of the three, the stagnant era, is from Apollo to the present day. The founding era extended from Sputnik in 1957 to the end of the Apollo space program in 1972 and is coextensive, or was coextensive, with the space race, comprising 15 years. In his Civilization, A Personal View, Kenneth Clark noted that, quote, Great movements in the arts, like revolutions, don't last for more than about 15 years, unquote. In so saying, he might well have been speaking of the founding era of space exploration, a revolution which he had just lived through as he spoke these lines. There's a term for the duration that usually characterizes great movements and revolutions, which is what the founding era was, and as Clarke humanistically described them. And this is what Fernand Braudel called a conjuncture. Braudel distinguished three kinds of history, as I discussed in my episode on Braudel. Quote, time may be divided into different timescales and thus made more manageable. One can look at the long or the very short or the very long term, the various rates of medium-term change, which will be known in this book as the conjuncture, and the rapid movement of very short-term developments, the shortest usually being the easiest to detect, unquote. Braudel also touched on these terms in the glossary to his The Identity of France, where he defined the longue durée, literally the long term, as an expression drawing attention to long-term structures and realities in histories as distinct from medium-term trends or factors, the conjuncture, and long short-term events. Richard Main, in his translator's introduction to Braudel's A History of Civilizations, argued that Braudel had arrived at his tripartite levels of periodization as a response to the problem posed by the relationship between and the concurrent exhibition of the immediacy and drama of history as it transpires before our eyes, and the silent background to these events, which changes little but constitutes the context that makes the passing spectacle meaningful and comprehensible. Main described Braudel's three nested periodizations intended to address this problem in the following terms. Quote, the quasi-immobile time of structures and traditions, la longue durée, the immediate scale of conjunctures, I should say the intermediate scale of conjunctures, rarely longer than a few generations, and the rapid time scale of events, unquote. Braudel de-emphasized the history of the event, and Braudel's revaluation, if not devaluation of the event, is the occasion of a quote from Braudel that is poignantly instructive for his conception of history. Quote, events are the ephemera of history, and they pass across its stage like fireflies, hardly glimpsed before they settle back into darkness and as often as not into oblivion, unquote. Intuitive and a naive historiography, if there is such a thing, and which we might also call folk historiography, privileges the event, much as it privileges narrative. A narrative usually takes the form of a succession of events, often succeeding one another at a rapid pace. As Braudel put it, quote, all historical work is concerned with breaking down time past, choosing among its chronological realities according to more or less conscious preferences and exclusions. Traditional history, with its concern for the short time span for the individual and the event, has long accustomed us to the headlong, dramatic, breathless rush of its narrative, unquote. What I've called the founding era, from Sputnik to the Apollo program, and possibly also the stagnant era after the Apollo program, can be considered historical conjunctures in a Braudel's sense, and both conjunctures fall within the longue durée of industrialized civilization, which is less than 300 years old. A space exploration mission like the Voyager program, which has endured for decades, constitutes its own conjuncture. In the popular media, however, it's the event that is noted and celebrated, torn from the context of its conjuncture and its longue durée. Voyager 2, for example, was in the news in 2018 because it had passed out of the solar system, as Voyager 1 had earlier in 2012. This was an event, and as Braudel said, it has passed across the stage like a firefly, hardly glimpsed before it settles back into darkness and eventually into oblivion. For space exploration to be more than an ephemeral sequence of events, to be something more than a headlong, dramatic, breathless rush of narrative, it needs to be more than an event. It needs to be recognized as an age in which we find ourselves, the space age, or the longue durée of industrialized civilization converging upon and transforming itself into a spacefaring civilization. One way to do this is to begin thinking about space exploration in terms of the longue durée and, following Braudel, placing less emphasis upon the event. The justification for thinking historically about spacefaring civilization is to employ the conceptual resources of historiography to analyze and thus to clarify our relationship to historical time, even if this historical time constitutes a period we haven't yet completed or perhaps even not even entered. Arguably, we are not yet a spacefaring civilization, even if we are a space-capable civilization. But we can think historically about potential developments, regardless of whether or not they come to pass, and if they do come to pass, regardless of when they come to pass. This is where we find ourselves at today, not knowing whether anything will come of the space age, or if it does, when. The stagnant era, the present era of space exploration, is that period since the end of the Apollo era, which has been characterized by a lack of clear purpose, both public and private institutional drift, and a failure to aggressively develop the technologies of space exploration, that is to say, a failure to push the envelope of technological development. The stagnant era has endured for more than a half century now, threatening to be more than a conjuncture and potentially marking a longue durée of space age stagnation. We could posit a new period of the space age starting from when SpaceX begins successfully firing reusable rockets, which represents a new technological development in a way that NASA's SLS booster for the Artemis program does not, but it's too early to say if anything will come of this. As I've already implied, the existence of a space program is not in and of itself sufficient to liberate the fate of humanity from the surface of Earth. There are many possible space programs, and only some of them provide the means for a sufficient number of human beings to establish themselves away from Earth. Most space programs, real or imagined, fall far short of this capacity. The space program that followed the space race was a gesture to what was possible, but not a fulfillment of the possibilities offered by space technology and space exploration. The post-Apollo space program was an artifact of stagnation. I've written about the stagnation of the space age on several occasions, especially in a longish blog post that appeared on Centauri Dreams titled Bound in Shallows, Space Exploration and Institutional Drift. It's all too easy to imagine a history of space exploration in which we have the Apollo program finishing off the space race, or what I call the founding era, and then more than 50 years later we have the Artemis program with a disposable rocket that represents no technological breakthroughs over Apollo hardware, and then maybe another 50 years or more on we have a Mars mission, and so on. This schedule for space exploration could be literally perpetuated for centuries, and we could find ourselves in the 22nd century, and then the 23rd century, and then the 24th century, with only a few flags and footprint missions to our credit. All the while, each of these incremental steps will be hailed as great events, when in fact each step, more tentative and hesitant than the last, is like an admission that we are never going to get serious about space exploration. We could, with some justification, call this a Potemkin space program. It's important to note in this connection that a Potemkin space program is a threat to no one and a challenge to no one, and that makes it a politically valuable tool. The reality of the status quo can continue indefinitely while giving that status quo the appearance of bold exploration and adventure. And there are many who would be perfectly happy with this outcome, that is to say, an all but stagnant space program for the foreseeable all but stagnant future. Not only would all the legacy bureaucrats and legacy contractors welcome this, but everyone who can't understand that humanity has a no future if we don't develop the technologies to live beyond Earth. And there's an enormous social, technological, and economic inertia behind this failure of understanding. To the billions living on Earth with no hope for a better life, As the world's governments tighten their collective grip, relentlessly transforming themselves into total surveillance states, any incremental space program such as I have described will seem to be an insignificant detail with no meaning for them, and they'll be right in thinking this. A space program or programs conducted in this way will accomplish little. If humanity's fate remains exclusively tied to Earth, the wider universe will remain forever innocent of it. And for someone like Bertrand Russell during the Cold War, that was a good thing because it was a cosmological impiety for human beings to tread beyond Earth. No one's life is going to be changed by a Potemkin space program. Soon, the nascent space age will be the first space century from 1957 to 2057, and then a century will become 2 centuries, and then 3 centuries and more. If the space age is nothing more than this, it will be one among many ages of no great significance, and it won't mark a new epoch in human history. But if the space age eventually becomes something more than this, then the space age will be like the machine age, which I take to be coextensive with the Industrial Revolution, which altered the pattern of human life almost as much as agricultural civilization altered the previous hunter-gatherer pattern of human life. That is to say, the space age holds the potential of being a macro periodization on a par with the most significant historical transformations that have shaped human life to date. A new spacefaring civilization would build on these previous transformations of human life. Each new form of civilization, or more generally, each new human way of life, inherits something from the previous way of life, maintaining an historical continuity even while inaugurating a new age that supplants and supersedes the previous age. Much is lost in the transition, but not everything is lost. Each age that establishes a distinctive way of life lays the foundation for the next age and its distinctive way of life, however different the two may be. We could call these ways of life forms of life, following the later Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein only used form of life, or Lebensform, 5 times in his philosophical investigations, but the idea has gone on to take on a life of its own among Wittgenstein commentators, some of which make forms of life central to Wittgenstein's later thought. I'm not going to try to develop this any further today, but the literature on Wittgenstein's conceptions of forms of life could be used to elucidate macrohistorical changes when forms of life change. Roughly, however, we could say that a macrohistorical change occurs when there is a change in our form of life. And in the present context, this means that the macrohistorical change would be a spacefaring civilization that would mean the appearance of a spacefaring form of life. How might a spacefaring form of life grow out of contemporary space programs? I call it a spacefaring breakout when there is an inflection point when we pass from a merely symbolic Potemkin space program to the exploitation of space exploration that transforms human life and civilization. And I once again make a tripartite distinction among spacefaring breakouts that I call early, mediocre, and late spacefaring inflection points. And I'll explain each of these inflection points in historiographical terms. An early inflection point is when spacefaring is pursued with exponential scope and scale as a continuous sequence of events, so that the immediate prehistory conjuncture to space exploration is followed by the founding era conjuncture, and the founding era conjuncture is followed by a further conjuncture that builds upon the founding era. In other words, you're going up and up and up and up and up. Each conjuncture represents another advance over the previous, and the development continues instead of stalling out in stagnation. This sequence of conjunctures, in turn, begins to define a spacefaring longue durée. A mediocre inflection point is when spacefaring is pursued with exponential scope and scale only after the founding era conjuncture is followed by several further conjunctures, some of them tightly coupled with the founding era, and some only loosely coupled with the founding era. But the sequence of conjunctures eventually leads to a spacefaring breakout conjuncture within the same long delay period within which the technology became available. So in other words, you've got this long delay of development, and the spacefaring initial event like Sputnik occurs, and then somewhere in the same long delay later along the line, but several conjunctures later, then you get the breakout that becomes something that changes civilization. In a late inflection point, you have a spacefaring that's pursued with exponential scope and scale only after the technology has been available throughout a complete long delay period of history, so that a spacefaring breakout appears in a subsequent long delay period of history. So here, as in contrast to the mediocre version, you have a long delay in which the initial spacefaring event occurs, like Sputnik, and then you have an entire long delay of civilization followed by another. The late breakout occurs in the following long delay period of history. In this way, the founding era is the culminating conjuncture for space technologies within a given long delay, and after lapsing for a time, the next spacefaring conjuncture occurs in the next long delay. It's possible further that this historical rhythm might be iterated several times over before a spacefaring breakout occurs as a result of one of these spacefaring conjunctures. So in other words, you might get, in a long delay period, several conjunctures where space exploration seems to be gaining momentum and is going to crest over into a breakout, but it doesn't happen necessarily the first, second, or third time. It happens somewhere down the line. With our 50-year plus stagnant era, we've already foreclosed on the possibility of an early spacefaring breakout. So that's not our civilization. It's some counterfactual civilization or some other civilization elsewhere in the universe. We may yet see a mediocre spacefaring breakout if the contemporary space development of private industry picks up the torch earlier laid down by the space programs of nation states. If this effort falters, after an indeterminate long delay of stagnation, we could see a late spacefaring breakout, but none of this, of course, is guaranteed. Our history to date is entirely consistent with no spacefaring breakout at all, and no transformation of civilization or of human life as a result of the space age. The potential is there, but the potential requires a catalyst for its realization. That we live in the space age because we have the capability for space travel, while we don't fully exploit that capability, is a kind of historical formality. If and when that historical formality becomes historical materiality remains an unanswered question, and I consider it unfortunate that I won't live long enough to see what becomes of the space age and therefore to know the answer to the question. Hegel said that the owl of Minerva takes flight only with the setting of the sun. If the space age is a great age of transformation for humanity, then the sun is only now rising, and it won't set until the space age is over, and then the owl of Minerva can soar in the dusk over all that has transpired since. I envy the future historians and philosophers of history who will have all this laid out before them as what Hayden White called the historical field, for them to implot and interpret as they will. Thanks for listening.